Hello everyone, my name is Raphael Schapira. I'm a PhD candidate at the Graduate Institute Geneva and a visiting PhD scholar at the KU Leuven. My presentation is entitled Fighting the Good Fight, Urban Evangelical Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Rio de Janeiro's Periphery. With this title, I want to point to the sport's religious, ethical and urban dimensions, which I see captured in the picture in the background. The picture shows a group of children, teenagers, and their coaches standing together at the rooftop of a church in a neighborhood marked by urban violence. I took this picture on the inauguration day of this evangelical judo and Brazilian jiu-jitsu project, about which I will talk more later. This event sensitized me for the religious dimensions of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which I researched between September 2017 and August 2018. During my research, I used embodied and classical research methods. That means I not only interviewed and observed the actions of the research participants, but also trained with them. For their friendship, shared knowledge, and training sessions, I thank them wholeheartedly. To protect their privacy, I used pseudonyms in this presentation. Manifestations of evangelical Brazilian jiu-jitsu athletes are ubiquitous in the Brazilian jiu-jitsu culture of Rio de Janeiro. Gestures are often employed by evangelical Brazilian jiu-jitsu athletes to express their religious identity, like the one you can see on the picture. The athlete, who has just won a fight, gives a thumbs up to God, thanking for his victory. Overall, I identified three forms of evangelical Brazilian jiu-jitsu: a church-based, a coach-based, and an athlete-based form, which I present to you quickly to give you an idea of the diversity of evangelical Brazilian jiu-jitsu. The first form refers to Brazilian jiu-jitsu practiced in churches. In this case, training takes place on the church's ground, often in the same room where church service usually takes place. Mats replace the chairs, and the church is transformed into a temporary evangelical gym, the remaining accessoires such as crosses on the wall serving as a reminder for the primacy of religion in this place. Another form is Brazilian jiu-jitsu classes led by evangelical coaches. These coaches usually include prayer into their courses, although other coaches teaching in the same gym do not necessarily do this. In the picture, you can see students and coaches forming a big circle and holding hands during the prayer with which the classes ended. The third form is the already mentioned individual expression of religious identity. You have already seen one example of expressing religious identity through gestures. Here you see three men expressing their religious identity through t-shirts, on which is written in Portuguese, Social Project, and English, Christian Fighters, in addition to the name of their team. You can see another example of the third form on this slide. Here, an athlete uses a patch suit to his Brazilian jiu-jitsu uniform, which reads, God in heaven, jiu-jitsu on the ground, besides the image of a kneeling athlete. Maybe it is not surprising to see that many Brazilian jiu-jitsu athletes express their evangelical religious identity, given that according to the Brazilian 2010 census, 22% of the Brazilian population self-identifies as evangelical. Together with a number of Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioners, which according to official figures by the Brazilian Ministry of Sports accounted to 1.9 million practitioners in 2013, it is reasonable to estimate the number of evangelical Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioners to be around 418,000 for the year 2013. Unfortunately, there do not exist more recent figures, but the number of evangelical Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioners is likely to have grown since then, as evangelicalism and Brazilian jiu-jitsu continue to be on the rise. Given the growing importance of evangelical Brazilian jiu-jitsu and mixed martial arts, it is no wonder that researchers have begun studying this phenomenon. Evangelical pastors and the flock have embraced Brazilian jiu-jitsu and mixed martial arts, as shown by Junge and Storkel in their documentary. Justin Greve analyzes how these practitioners make the trained body the central element of their religious practice, through which they, according to Jessica Rivers, create interpersonal intimacy and proximity to God. However, in my opinion, the study of evangelical Brazilian jiu-jitsu needs to bring together in a theoretical framework the entanglement of A, the urban environment, B, sport and religious ethics, and C, spiritual warfare. In this presentation I aim to answer the question how practitioners create evangelical Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at the confluence of these three dimensions. I will show you now a short video clip I filmed at the inauguration of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Judo project I mentioned in the introduction. Although it is fascinating in many different aspects, here I want to point out the urban dimension of the speech given by the coach Gabriel Machado to his students. In the background you can see Carlinhos Silva, Gabriel's teacher, who is a highly ranked Judo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner overseeing the technical aspects of the project, as well as some of the students' parents in the background.
Nós teremos também, nesse judô, a oração que a gente não pode deixar de agradecer.
We also have in this judo the prayer. We can't stop thanking God for everything He does for us and for everything He has done. We live in the favela. Everybody knows that, right? And we get up from our beds and go to school and to work and come back alive. That's already reason to thank God, because you know that every day we are in mortal danger. We're here alive because God gave us this gift of life. So let's make Jiu-Jitsu our way to glorify our God. Show Him that we are good.
Então nós vamos fazer do jiu-jitsu a nossa maneira de glorificar o nosso Deus, mostrar para Ele que nós somos bons.
In his speech, Gabriel Machado points to the violent living conditions favela residents find themselves in. According to the New York Times, the harsh law and order measures implemented by Rio de Janeiro's Governor Wilson Witzel since 2018 have resulted in the highest number of people killed by the police in 2 decades. The intensification of the war on drugs has also intensified the militarization and the confinement of favela residents, as described by Machado da Silva. Evangelical Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu projects function, therefore, as informal means of community organization of favela residents, similar to evangelical churches as analyzed by Stefan Lanz. Evangelical Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu projects give children and teenagers in Rio de Janeiro's periphery the possibility to develop an alternative sense of self that might keep them away from seeking employment in the dark business. The picture on this slide shows a female evangelical pastor preaching to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu students at the beginning of a training session on the streets of the favela in Rio de Janeiro's North Zone. The pastor stands sided by Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coaches who have taken on a praying posture too. Mats have been laid out in the middle of the narrow street, leaving only a small path on each side for pedestrians. By occupying the favela's main street, the Evangelical Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu project temporarily disputes the spatial and symbolic hegemony of the drug business. Religious and sports ethics confluence at this powerful moment of prayer on the mats, turning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu into a form of embodying the evangelical way of being in this world. The understanding of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a way of embodying evangelical ethics is made very clear by Gabriel Machado's last 2 sentences in the video you saw when he said, quote, "So let's make Jiu-Jitsu our way to glorify God. Show Him that we are good." Unquote. In my interpretation, good refers to acting ethically during the practice of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which becomes a way to enact and embody religious commandments. When I asked Gabriel how he reconciles the fact that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu can be perceived as violent, going against Christian ethics, he answered, quote, "When you fight Jiu-Jitsu, you don't use your rage. You use your intelligence, your wisdom, and your knowledge. Jiu-Jitsu teaches you to respect the limitations of your neighbor, and the church teaches you to love your neighbor. So when you respect the limitations of your neighbor, you love your neighbor." Unquote. Bruno Guedes, the one on the picture, has a similar view. He told me that competing in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is actually not about fighting but about making new friends, although the athlete tries to make the opponent tap, that is, signaling defeat by generating bodily pain. Making friends with Bruno, you can see me in the picture with the thumbs up sign, fascinated by the patch on his jacket which reads, quote, "Athletes of Christ, believe in the Lord Jesus and you and your dojo will be saved." Unquote. This patch gives a slight variation to Acts 16:31 in changing household with dojo. In the New Testament it says, quote, "Believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your household." Unquote. Changing household with dojo already speaks volumes about the importance of the place of training for evangelical jiu-jitsu practitioners. The way evangelical Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioners interpret the meaning of their sport as non-violent, contrary to the immediately visible action is, for me, an example for how ethics are embodied and concrete, and in the words of Webkin, quote, embedded in the specificity of social life within communities, unquote. The interpretation of these ethics is, however, contested, as is evidenced in the discussion of whether Brazilian jiu-jitsu or mixed martial arts can actually be Christian sports from an ethical point of view. Christian researchers like Watson and Brooke oppose this view, whereas research on Christian mixed martial arts fans in the US by Borer and Schaeffer has revealed that fans take an ambivalent position between enjoying the technical aspects and rejecting the displayed violence. Finally, practitioners, as already mentioned, do not perceive Brazilian jiu-jitsu as violent, emphasizing the technical proficiency necessary to practice the sport and the aspect of taking care of one's opponents by not willingly wanting to hurt them. This discussion is reminiscent of the debate between van Bottenburg and Heilbronn and Sanchez Garcia and Malcolm, whether the sport mixed martial arts is a sign of a decivilizing tendency in society, thus opposing Norbert Elias' theory of the civilizing process. That the insider view and embodied experience of Brazilian jiu-jitsu and mixed martial arts can be quite different from a disembodied evaluation is evidenced by the meme which you can see on this slide. It shows a Brazilian jiu-jitsu brown belt that is joined by the description Bible and jiu-jitsu, and a citation from the New Testament, Hebrew 12:1, saying, quote, "Therefore let us also lay aside every weight, and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." Unquote. In my interpretation, this meme expresses the idea that evangelical Brazilian jiu-jitsu should be practiced in a state of mind that puts away any negative thoughts to act in concordance with Brazilian jiu-jitsu and religious ethics like love and endurance. However, despite these positive ethics, many evangelical Christians also see themselves amidst a permanent battle between good and evil forces. In their view, satanic forces are constantly trying to influence people negatively, drawing them away from Christian ethics. The specificity of Brazilian jiu-jitsu lies in allowing practitioners to react to this battle by bringing together spiritual and actual fighting. I discussed this topic with Pastor Boaventura dos Santos, whom you can see on the picture kneeling behind the coach. Pastor Boaventura dos Santos practiced Brazilian jiu-jitsu in the past. Although he stopped training, he remains connected to the sport through his children who take classes with the Brazilian jiu-jitsu coach you can see on the picture in a pink uniform. After class, the coach invited him onto the mats to give a sermon to the children and teenagers. For this occasion, they formed a circle and kneeled in the César position. It is a widely known practice in Budo sports such as judo and more traditional schools of Brazilian jiu-jitsu to sit in the César position, for which the legs are folded underneath the thighs as the coach is doing, and to bow as a way of greeting. However, as you can see in this picture, the participants are burying their heads in the hands, thus forming a praying posture. Additionally, they remained in this posture during the sermon, thus creating a powerful bodily metaphor bringing together the Brazilian jiu-jitsu way of bowing with a praying posture. When I asked the pastor after class what difference there is between jiu-jitsu and religion, he answered, quote, "I don't see the struggle, the practice of jiu-jitsu, and faith, the practice in God, as separate and distinct things but as one thing only." Unquote. Wanting to understand the relation between actual training and the spiritual realm better, I continued by asking, quote, is the fight people practice with their bodies the image of the spiritual struggle? Unquote. And Pastor Boaventura dos Santos answered, quote, "I can say that, in some moments, yes, it is an image of the spiritual struggle in that sense. The Bible says that we don't fight against flesh and blood, but our fight is against what we believe in the spiritual world, the evil. So to face the spiritual enemy that is not of blood, you need the fight, and nothing better than training. Hard training, easy combat. If I want to fight the spiritual hosts, I must be well trained." Unquote. In my opinion, being well trained refers to the embodiment of Christian ethics such as love and endurance, which are instilled into the practitioners via Evangelical Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training. The incorporation of the Evangelical Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu habitus enables practitioners to transfer the skills learned in the gym to the field of spiritual warfare. According to Paul Bramadat, the term spiritual warfare denotes, quote, both the war between angels and demons for influence over humans and the human contribution to this ongoing battle, unquote. Evangelicals can experience spiritual warfare in their daily lives as a conflict between impulses that respond to personal desires and Christian ethical values that regulate these, which evangelicals interpret as a battle between divine and diabolic forces. Contrary to spiritual warfare in other contexts, spiritual warfare in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu involves training the body. Even spiritual warfare practiced in religious boot camps, as described by Elizabeth McAllister, understands training the body as secondary to prayer. Although McAllister recounts how she and the other recruits have to march and learn military discipline, she does not mention any additional exercises in which the recruits have to participate. However, in Evangelical Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there is a clear focus on training the body. In my understanding of Pastor Boaventura dos Santos' statement, practicing Evangelical Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is already part of spiritual warfare. Subjecting the body to rigorous training does not just serve as a way to instill discipline into students so that they can later wage spiritual warfare in prayer, but is an integral part of it. In this logic, training fighting is not just a metaphor referring to some deeper meaning. Training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is already a means to glorify God, as Gabriel Machado said. In my opinion, this interpretation is also visible in the athlete tattoo you can see on the picture on this slide. It shows Jesus with the body of an athlete on the cross. His muscular chest and abdomen are accentuated, giving a specific idea about his character. This is not a suffering and physically frail man who is hanging his head as he is nailed to the cross, but a muscular athlete holding his head up high even in a situation of despair. There is no physical difference between the athlete's muscular body and that of the tattooed image of Jesus. Analyzing depictions of Jesus as a muscular man among evangelicals, Justin Greve recognizes, quote, a theology of the body, in which body, mind, and spirit are inextricably linked. For evangelical Christians, the image of a manly Jesus who did not tap out or quit has theological and ideological meaning in and of itself, unquote. The image of a muscular Jesus tattooed on the back of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athlete expresses his identification with a Jesus who is a fighter, physically capable of wrestling with demons on the spiritual battlefield. Coming to my conclusions, I would like to point out the fact that Evangelical Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is likely to grow in the next decade. This has two reasons. First, the number of evangelicals in Brazil is projected to rise to 40% of the population by 2030, equaling with the percentage of Catholics. Second, there seems to be a growing acceptance of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu among evangelicals and the society in general, as evidenced by several initiatives at the state and national level, working on integrating Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu into school curricula. The growing acceptance is due to a process of sportization, a term coined by Norbert Elias, that describes the stricter regulation of sports around the idea of fair play. This process has changed the previous image of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a brutal sport and transformed it into a sport perceived as beneficial for youth development. As I showed in my presentation, to understand the growing acceptance of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu among evangelicals in Rio de Janeiro's periphery, it is necessary to consider the entanglement of sport, religion, and urban environment. Especially practitioners see the ethics of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and evangelicalism as compatible. They transfer the specific ethics of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu like discipline and perseverance to the religious realm and vice versa. Evangelical Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners make their sport part of the spiritual warfare against otherworldly entities by embodying evangelical ethics, thus fusing sport and religion. The spiritual fighting is mirrored by the urban violence many of Rio de Janeiro's evangelical Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioners must endure. Participants in Rio's peripheric evangelical martial arts clubs, therefore, learn to practice Brazilian jiu-jitsu as a way to embody their religious belief, their religious self, and to come to terms with their violent surroundings by understanding the earthly and the spiritual world as a world of fighting. For your interest, on this slide you find the references. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Please write to me if you have any questions, comments, or if you just want to network. See you next time.